mean, there's just so much out there we got to say no to. And it's very difficult. When you see people, you love them, your heart goes out to them, you want to minister to them.
Buongiorno. You're listening to Going, Where God is at Work, a podcast that sits at the intersection of missions theory and practice. We're walking out our call to ministry in faraway places and happy to have you join us on the journey. I'm your host, Jesse Pauli, a missions leader serving in Rome, and I'm here with Alessandro Di Leonardo, church planner in Cisterna di Latina, and Jen Williamson, our missiologist who lives and works in Lyon. And today we have a special guest with us, Margaret Fitzwater, the executive director for the Navigators' Train, Develop, and Care Department. Welcome, Margaret. Welcome, Jen and Alessandro.
Thanks. Great to be here.
How are you guys? How's everybody doing? Getting ready for the Christmas season. We're recording this was a week before Christmas, but we'll be releasing it a little bit later. So
yeah, I'm excited for Christmas. I always love it. Things kind of get to slow down a little bit because everybody's so focused on Christmas that I think it's just a great time. I love Advent, spending extra time with God, just, the whole season. Love to celebrate it.
It's awesome. Yeah,
we've been working on some homemade gifts. So that's been fun I'm trying to get them finished up before the holidays. And so in the evenings, I'm sitting down and crocheting and have some pottery pieces that are just needing to be glazed before they're finished. So that's a fun part of the season for me.
Does it snow where you're at, Jen?
Occasionally, but not much. It doesn't stick. But I could be in the Alps in an hour. So we often drive up there to the snowy Alps to get some good raclette over the Christmas holiday.
Well, we have my father-in-law in town, so we've been doing all kinds of fun activities and enjoying having him for Christmas. Well, why don't we jump right into our episode? If you've been following from our previous episode on Member Care by the Book, today we have our interview with Margaret. Margaret, we introduced you as an expert in member care on our last episode. Can you go ahead and just tell us how God brought you to this place of being an expert in member care?
Wow. Well, I don't know about the expertise, but it's been a long journey. But yeah, so it started. I met my husband at graduate school, and we both went to work for Fortune 100 companies in corporate for a long time. And during that time, we were totally sold out to Jesus, and we actually had started serving on a board of directors for ministry. And basically, we went to an early mega church in the early 80s. And we were one of our best friends. A really good friend was the senior pastor at the church. And probably a year and a half into our marriage, a real surprise happened. And he actually had an extramarital affair with another woman. And it it was horrible. The church split, all sorts of things happened. But another really good friend of ours was the associate pastor, one of the associate pastors at the church. And he and his wife were like super best friends with the senior pastor. They were a little bit older than we were. And they had bought retirement property together, all that kind of stuff. And they ended up going to a retreat center because we were all blown away. And we just had no clue what had happened. There were only a couple of ministries to pastors and missionaries during those in the 80s and the early 80s. And, nobody understood really what was happening. And this church was in Dallas, Texas. And that year there were 3 senior pastors of mega churches that fell due to similar kind of activities. And so it was just a quandary. And so a lot of research was being done, what's causing this? And we knew him personally. He was our friend. We knew he loved Jesus. It's like, what happened? How could that happen? So anyway, our other friends came back from the retreat center and they said, gosh, while we were there, the counselors asked us a question that we've been processing through. And that was, if you could do anything in the world and you knew that you couldn't fail, what would it be? And he said, Sandy and I just felt like that if there was anything we could really do, it would be to start a ministry that would prevent what just happened from happening. And so that was the beginning of us beginning to help them. They basically turned around to us. They said, So we have some thoughts or ideas, but we need to learn a lot. Could you help us do it? We don't know anything about the business side. So, starting a ministry, anything like that. So we help them begin and launch a ministry to pastors and missionaries with the intent of preventing burnout. And that's what, as they started doing research, they really began to understand the process that people who love Jesus a lot go through, a very slow process of losing passion, that passion for Jesus and for people, and just getting tired, weary. And I love in the Message version. I think one of you mentioned Matthew 11 in the previous podcast, but in the Message version it says, "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." So we started a retreat center doing actually kind of spiritual formation retreats with pastors and missionaries to try to help prevent this whole thing. So we did that for several years. Our ministry grew super fast because there weren't a whole lot of places like that.
Yeah.
And we just had a waiting list that we couldn't, that we just couldn't handle. It was just so big. We ended up building facilities, but during that time, we were serving on that board. We basically started the ministry, served on the board of directors. But there was a time during that period where we had the long waiting list. We were trying to hire more staff, looking for people who could run the ministry. And actually, Dr. Howard Hendricks is, you may know that name, but he is just an amazing leadership person. And he stood up in that meeting and said, "We're not finding that person because that person's right here in this room." And we were so corporately minded. We thought, we just didn't have we'd never considered going on staff personally with the ministry. But anyway, that led to 2 years of really God chasing us. I won't even go into that story. It was crazy. But, we finally relented and said, "Okay, God, we'll do it." So we went on staff with that ministry, and it continued to grow. Like I said, built facilities, all kinds of stuff. The capacity grew. And then we're builders, growers, and we got to a point to where it was sustainable. And we heard about the Navigators, and the Navigators actually had a growing church ministry to pastors, and they already had a lot of missionary ministries. But we found out that, the Navigators had discipleship. That's what they were all about. And at that point in time, and we had actually gotten connected with our best friends early on because we were all heavily involved in evangelism ministries. And we had seen for years, and we just thought the problem with people in the church is they're not growing into this relationship that they've started with Jesus. Nobody's helping them to grow. And we were guilty of that too. We want them to check the box, go on to the next people, share the gospel, get more people into the kingdom. And so we realized, wow, the Navigators have this discipleship stuff that helps them to grow up in Christ. So we were really excited about that. And then the other thing is the Navigators had kind of a member care department. They didn't call it that, but it was a care portion of the Navigators. And we thought, wow, this ministry cares for their pastors. They care for their missionaries. They care about their people. And that was very attractive to us. And they, like I said, they had a ministry that needed growing. That's what we were all about. So we left the previous ministry and went to the Navigators to start serving in their church ministries, which we did for several years. We started leading that. So we were co-directors of that mission, serving churches and churches that have missionaries. And then about 5 years ago, we actually moved over to Train, Develop, Care, which you had mentioned. So it's kind of a long journey, but that was it.
Wow. That's so neat. I feel like that happens, or not happens a lot, but that happens in the sense of like you often deep dive into something when it's a close experience. Like if it's, something happens to you or around you, then that pushes you. And it sounds like that's what happened with your friend and the affair. And that's so cool. So you talked a little bit about doing this with your husband. Do you have any children? You want to share a little bit about your families?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I love about Christmas so much is the whole family. I just love family. My husband passed with cancer
Okay,
3 years ago.
sorry to hear that.
So I have two adult sons, one who's married with my first two grandbabies that are awesome. My other son's still single. He is an Air Force pilot in the U.S. Air Force.
So he's like a literal maverick, like I was talking about
He is. He is.
the missionary mavericks. That's so cool. Wow, thank you for sharing about that. We wanted to just pick your brain on a few things on member care. Jen had said that she had a few interactions with you and just how brilliant you were in this area. And so one of the things we kind of I think gave for a given in our first episode, but would love to pose the question to you is why do missionaries need member care? From your perspective, why is it important for these departments to exist within mission agencies or outside of them?
Yeah, well, that one I can answer from experience because I needed it when we were on that side. I think when God calls you clearly to his great commission, it is, there's just so much out there we got to say no to. And it's very difficult. When you see people, you love them, your heart goes out to them, you want to minister to them. And so you're always on this thing. And it's hard to say no. It is very difficult to say no. And often that need that's right in front of you takes precedent over our families and sometimes even our precedence over our relationship with God. And so as time goes on, that relationship with God, we just lose that personal passion for him and we just get so plugged into all the needs. And we need somebody to just kind of come alongside us and help us to get a grip on reality and to do some self-care and to listen to some other people.
Well, as you were saying that, the thing that stood out to me was like someone who's a people pleaser or someone who has like a gift of service. I wonder if there's like a higher contingency of those gifted people that fall to burnout, because I never thought of it as seeing needs and saying no to certain needs to protect your relationship. Like I tend to be a person that likes to do acts of service, and so like I can easily say yes to a lot of the needs, and I'm thinking of other people I know that have that kind of giftingness too.
No, I said I agree. I think that's probably true.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm not a maverick. I think one of the things that I'm curious about, so I grew up in Italy and then my family moved to America when I was 9 years old. So I always kind of felt not fully American. And so there's a lot of American things that I don't relate with. And I remember going to college where all the Americans were getting, I think they're called gift baskets when your family sends you something. Are they called gift baskets? And
Yeah, we have lots of those.
okay, so it's just such an American thing. Like my immigrant friends in college, they weren't getting those. And so I kind of saw when I went into mission field, kind of thinking of mission care being such an American thing. Of course, I wasn't thinking that way, but as I'm processing it, again, I wasn't trying to go to the mission field as a maverick, like, oh, I'm a lone ranger. Just kind of thinking this is like an American thing to do. I'm just curious, you working in member care worldwide, do you see other agencies who are sending from different countries kind of emphasizing on member care?
Oh, I see lots of people emphasizing on that, and the ones who don't, a lot of those are trying to start something, or trying to do something, or maybe they work with an agency that does it for them. Although having it internal, I know that one of the things that I think that blesses a lot of our own staff is we have a shepherd's network, and we just do equipping a couple of times a year, just something, some topic or subject. But some of them, their role they're out in the field with all of our missionaries, and they just sometimes they just take people to lunch. They have a budget to take people to lunch and just check in, see how they're doing, and I think that's very, very helpful. So just having contact with somebody who cares about you.
Yeah, I was wondering a similar question along those lines, Alessandro, because from a North American perspective, there's been certain stigmas. I think definitely it seems like the older generation maybe looked less towards counseling or member care. The younger generation seems to be looking more towards it. I know I'm African American, and there's a lot of stereotypes about African American men in particular not taking care of themselves, not looking for help through counseling and things like that, mental health Yeah, do you see these stigmas taking place as you're interacting within your organization, or I don't know how much interaction you have also with other international organizations?
Yeah, I actually have a lot of interaction with other organizations. We network all the time with
Awesome.
other large mission organizations, and yeah, I think it does still impact. I don't think it's as bad as it used to be, and like now, it's not a really big deal. It's pretty common for people to have counselors or to go to a counselor. That the stigma is not the same, but it is still there, and especially within organizations there I think is always kind of a little fear if there's something not quite right about you, what will other people think? It kind of relates to how well I think our identity in Christ is. When we see if we are really rooted in our identity in Christ, then we can navigate better the waters of not being perfect, of realizing that, wow, we are flawed just like everybody else, but it's okay. And it's okay to share that. In fact, it's a good thing. But, I think in the last few years, the information and science of the brain has exploded. And we're finding so much about that. That's really helped the whole mental health thing, too. So, I mean, as far as people accepting and realizing it's a real thing, it's not just something that people are imagining.
So acknowledging that it hasn't always been this way, do you think that's been a change in the theology of the church? And I don't know how much of this has to do with the difference between Western theology or Eastern theology, and the difference culturally that we have too. But what are your thoughts there from a theological perspective? I mean, we know that the Bible talks about us being made of mind, body, spirit, and I think at least I recently read a book by Dr. Carl Payne called Spiritual Warfare, and one of the things he acknowledges in that book is that spiritual warfare is a component of what we're happening, but it doesn't mean that that's always the answer. And so he kind of argues, we don't always need to send someone to an exorcist if they're having some kind of problem. They might need to go to a psychologist or a counselor for their issue. Or there might also be situations where they do need an exorcist or need to talk to someone that can handle a spiritual matter. So yeah, where can you speak into that a little bit on the issue of theology?
Yeah, I think the whole you mentioned the Western world, and in the early '80s, I remember this book that came out by James Dobson. It was called Emotions. Can you trust them? And it's like there was just this real distrust. It's like, oh no, it's an emotion. And then in the '90s, I think this was when we were actually starting the ministry that I'd mentioned to pastors and missionaries, and that was in the mid '90s. And Pete Scazzaro came out with his first book called Emotionally Healthy Church. And then after that, there's an emotionally healthy spirituality, leadership, emotionally healthy church, discipleship, emotionally healthy everything. And I'll tell you, I know that was a game changer. That emotionally healthy church and beginning to deal with those emotional kind of concepts was a game changer in pastors and missionaries' lives. And they began to, I think it was probably in the '90s where people began to see that emotions were okay, that it's how we deal with them, it's what we do with them. In fact, gosh, I remember even it probably in the mid '90s, our son was very young, but he was having anger issues. And we were recommended to go to a counselor. We did some family counseling, which was really awesome. But his anger issue, I remember a really big game changer for him was that he came home and he said, Mom, he said, actually, most of the movements in history that have been amazing, he said, there's so many movements that have been started because of somebody's anger, because they turned that anger into the right thing. It became energy in the right direction. And so, we have come full circle now. And I think about all these emotional wheels that are out there. We use them. I use them, just trying to just sometimes identifying the emotion is the first step in healing. And so, I think it's much different today in the Western world. I think that my husband and I did a lot. I still do. I actually came back. I was in Africa just 2 months ago. And I think the Western world has not done nearly as good a job as dealing with emotions as I think some of the other countries in the world have done. I don't know about Europe, but I think that secularization, the Westernized world, has kind of left emotions behind because it became so big into rational thought and thinking that the feeling component just got left behind. And God gave us feelings. I love to think about emotions as kind of like a dashboard. The light comes on and it's like, we need to understand that. What is it telling about ourselves? What is it telling us about others? What is it telling about those relational things that are so important to us? That community that you guys talked about in that last podcast. So it's
Yeah.
critical.
And I think it's been a shift. I don't know. I'd love to hear from my co hosts here because as a Gen Xer, I'm squarely in Gen X. I was definitely raised in the church to be not just suspect of emotions. You can't trust them. I mean, the classic picture that comes to my mind is they would use this image of a train that was your faith, and then was the facts. I mean, the facts of Scripture, and the coal car was your faith, and that was supposed to feed the facts. And then the caboose was your emotions, and those were just supposed to trail behind, and you weren't supposed to let them drive the train. But all this brain research you're talking about tells us actually we're all pretty much being like living from our emotions and from our guts. And if Christ can redeem me, he can redeem all of me. He can redeem my emotions. And I've had to, with the help of people like Pete Scazzaro, to reframe my theology and get to the place where I can, yes, identify the emotion, assess the emotion, and then realize sometimes my emotions are lying to me. Sometimes my emotions are lying, and I have to say to that anger or to that whatever that emotion is, you know what? Here's the truth. Here's what God's word says to me. But sometimes my emotions are telling me the truth, like your son's point about anger. Sometimes that emotion is telling me something true that I need to hear. So it doesn't mean we throw out, all discernment and our emotions get to rule the day. But I think that, we've come from this pendulum swing which was so far extreme that you can never trust your emotions. Emotions, can you trust them? I mean, Dobson gives away his perspective right there in the title. We just were supposed to ignore them, suppress them, throw them away, rather than figuring out, and I think this is the era that we're in now, how can Christ redeem that part of me so that my emotions are aligned with God's emotions, because we have a God who is emotional.
Yeah, and I think to that point also, the idea of having to, like you were saying, Jen, discern and realize that, we're fallen people, we have flesh. And so, yeah, sometimes our raw emotions aren't necessarily right or true or whatever the right word is to use there.
Yeah, but to go with what Jen was saying, to go forward is sort of like, can you trust your emotions? And then when you get past that, who can you trust your emotions with? Just the story of Margaret, like your son had the confidence to talk to you about it. Whereas if we don't have member care, I'm just thinking like we're keeping all these emotions, even if we're like coming to terms with them, we don't have anybody to process it with. And I think going to my story, just talking to this person who now consider him my mentor, just be able to process things that I couldn't with my wife. I couldn't with my church members. I needed someone on the outside to help me process, to hear my emotions and help me discern.
Yeah, that's so true. It's like back in the 90s, there was this concept called the emotional cup. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that or not, but I thought it was really good. And you talk about processing those emotions. So, like if there's if a cup, like a measuring cup, we came out of the food industry. So I'll say there's a measuring cup, it has a meniscus, it kind of has a little, it's slightly rounded on the top. When you get to a place in a glass measuring cup. But when a cup is full, and there's a meniscus there, and it's full, one drop of water all of a sudden causes the whole cup the water will start coming out of the cup because it is full. It only takes one drop to get it to overflow. And those emotions, when we don't empty that regularly, that's how it's so. I mean, we've probably all experienced this in our homes. You say a little thing, and it's like, is your hair different today? It's like, what do you mean? Is my hair different? And it's like, all I did was ask a question. I didn't intend it to come out negatively, but it's just that emotional cup is full. If it doesn't get emptied frequently, then we have emotions that are not good and that are hurtful and painful to us and to others. lament. You mentioned Scazzera, I mentioned him, and I just thought about how much that has been helpful. I think that's one of the things that we have developed. We've done a lot of workshops with our staff on grief and loss. Scazzera says that grief and loss can enlarge the soul, actually increase our capacity to love and to be loved, that soul that kind of encases everything that we have. But grief has to be processed through appropriately, or else we don't. I've struggled with that with the loss of my husband. And that's one of the things I wanted to make sure that I did, because the pain was so great that I knew that if I didn't process through that over time, then that would be a problem for me. And I would have that overflow of the emotions in the wrong way too much.
Yeah, that leads right into the question I was going to ask, actually. What are some of the trends you see happening? Because one of the trends that I've been realizing more is grief, but thinking of grief in a wider than just losing a person. Because in my family, my mother-in-law passed away 2 years ago, and my sister-in-law, they passed away recently. But then that kind of helped me to start thinking of grief differently, and thinking of grief of like when you give up a childhood dream to pursue the call on missions, or different
Yeah.
elements that you're grieving. Are there other trends that you might have noticed in ministry world?
Yeah, there are. I think a lot of trends, and I totally agree with what you said. I think 2020, when COVID had post COVID, we started seeing a lot of things. There was a lot of isolation, so people were not relating with other people as much or as well, and so there was a lot of staff health issues that came out of 2020, and we saw it in 21, 22. We're still seeing that. Mental health costs, and insurance have increased greatly among mission organizations. That's pretty common across the board. And of course, insurance costs themselves are skyrocketing. So that has been especially noticeable. But I think when you think about those trends, a really huge thing is actually what Jen mentioned about the generational issues, I think. One of a big thing that we are noticing in the field, and these other organizations I network with are seeing the same things, is a lot of younger people. Well, it was actually in the 2010, 2015, the iPhones became really big, social media became really big, and social media became the relationships that people were having. And so when we talk about this next generation, I think that is huge. And already we're seeing people come into the field in their 20s, and this is current, in the 20s, who don't really know how to have the same intimate relationships like I was. We don't have the dinner table conversations. You don't have the sitting around and just enjoying each other's fellowship without somebody being on their phone. Relationships are just not understood and known and experienced the way that I did growing up. And so they come in, they fall in love with Jesus, they want to go to the mission field, and relationships are already an issue. They don't know how to build them or grow them. And then you get in a place where they can be even more isolated. So you have all kinds of relational issues. And then for years, you in that previous podcast, you guys mentioned those two studies that were done, and where relational conflict was actually the number one reason why people were coming off the field. It's relational issues. I don't know if it's still number one or not, but it's still a really big deal, relational conflict. So if you can't even have you don't have very many good positive relationships, it's no surprise that relational conflict is going to be an issue in the field, that you don't know how to resolve conflict among relationships when you have it.
Margaret, I wanted to, in regards to Jesse speaking about trends, I'm just curious because you had mentioned in the intro that what birthed your desire to be part of this, or where God used it, was unfortunately through the fallings of multiple pastors. Yours was, in one case, the church you were attending, but then you said there was two others. It's, to me, that was news. What's interesting is I feel like history is repeating itself. In our time, there were multiple, specifically during the pandemic. I'm just curious, what do you notice there, as far as like before there seemed to be nothing, because that's what you guys wanted to come into this desire of, at the time not called member care, but now that there is member care and it's developing, it's a lot stronger. Just curious, when all these things happened, what have you noticed the positive about, oh yeah, it's great now that we have this?
Well, I think member care and organization has, I think proactive care is huge. And I think the more that we can do that, the better off people are. And I think that has minimized it in our own organization and in others. I do know that, there was a seminary professor just recently that we were talking to that was saying that some of the trends he was saying through the seminary is that leaders are abusing their power and position a lot these days, and that there is a lot of people who are using that power, just the lack of integrity that's leading to moral failures, moral issues of all kinds of things, and that they were feeling the weight and stress of all the pressure of different generations, of all the things that we've talked about. A lot of that is going out there. I think that in the broader body of Christ, it's pretty big. But I'm grateful. I mean, yeah, we do have. I'm not going to say we're not without that in our organization, but we don't see it very often. That's very, very, very rare. So I'm really grateful for that.
I'm wondering, a trend that I feel like I'm seeing a lot of is anxiety in the younger generations. How are you seeing anxiety as an issue, particularly for missionaries?
Yeah, I think that is an issue in our organization too. Anxiety, stress and anxiety, both coming from the things that was. So we talked about COVID and all the things going on with the younger generation. So we're talking about people who are ministering to these people. They have their own issues and their own families, and then they're ministering to families that have those issues. So it just kind of goes up, builds a chain. So I think there has to be those kind of issues. But a lot of it, I think, is because this struggle with saying no and all those kind of things, the anxiety, the busyness. I think one of the biggest things that a lot of people have lost that was huge in my own life, and I know this is that goes back to that personal experience, but when we began to learn about Sabbath and rest, that was huge for our family. I just look at how we were heading, being actually on staff full time with the mission organization, and how we were not spending a lot of time with our family. We were just ministering either at church or in the mission arena all the time. And I began to, I read a book when our children were small, and it talked about, all these things that you could do with your kids on Sabbath. And anyway, I began to really understand that the Sabbath really was. Jesus says that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And it was made for us. It's a gift. It's such a gift. And I'll tell you, I guard my Sabbath like crazy now. I mean, and Scazzero talks about a 24-hour Sabbath. I pretty much Saturday night, I'm offline. I don't look at my email. I don't, if you want to get a hold of me, you can call. But that 24 hours is huge. Going into the rest of the week rested instead of tired and weary is huge. That day became and it still is. It is a day for family and friends that re-energize, reinvigorates my life. It just makes a huge difference. So I think the loss of Sabbath, I also think, I told you, evangelism was a huge ministry up front in our lives. And I still love, I want all of the people I know that Jesus gives us a better life. And, I think Sabbath could be a great evangelism tool if we actually started practicing it. If we just practice Sabbath like we preach it, it would be very attractive, I think, to this society that is so burned out and stress and anxiety, because it's difficult to deal with those emotions when you're tired. If you're rested, you can do it well.
Margaret, I remember when we had been on the field for about 10 years, I had someone who was kind of just looking over my shoulder at my schedule and the stuff I was involved in. And they're like, how are you not burned out? You have, by all evaluative measures, I had quote unquote, too much on my plate. And I said, well, I can tell you one thing. We guard our Sabbath very, very seriously. I would say religiously, not legalistically, but in the sense that I know that's what's sustaining me. And I have a hard stop. For us, we did Sabbath on Saturday because we were church workers. We were preaching on Sunday. We were working on Sunday. So Sabbath was Saturday for us. Same thing. Friday night, my husband makes homemade pizza. And it is a hard stop. 24 hours on everything. And I get a lot of pushback on that, particularly from people who are like, well, I can take 2 hours here and 3 hours there, or, it doesn't have to be 24 hours. Or I've even heard but I really love my work. And I would think, yeah, I love my work too. That doesn't mean I don't need a Sabbath. I think I'm better at my work because of the hard stop. And I probably love it more because of the hard stop. But I had not connected Sabbath in that way to like, it's a mental health prevention measure that God calls us and invites us into, that he put into place before we knew we needed it. And we're missing the gift. And what an antidote that must be for things like anxiety. To take my hands off the wheel for 24 hours and say the world will keep spinning and God will keep working without me for 24 hours.
It is.
It's an act of faith
trust
too, right? It's an act of trust. I can stop because God isn't sleeping.
Yeah, I think that anxiety, stress relates to that. Again, goes back to that identity, because when we're not rooted in Christ, it's so easy to take things on ourselves that we shouldn't, and actually to feel like we have to be different than who we are, to put on this mask. That was one of the things with the first ministry that we served in. I have people that ask me all the time, how do you have so much energy? How do you have much, how can you do all that you do? And it's, I think it's because I learned a long time ago, I was not going to wear a mask. I was going to be who God made me to be and do the work that he called me to do, like he says in Ephesians 2:10. But when we put on mask, when we try to be somebody we're not, it takes a lot of energy. And when we can be authentic, when we can be real and transparent, it is so much easier. It doesn't take that energy, and the anxiety and stress is so less. What you see is what you get. Like it or not, that's the way God made me. This is what he's called me to do, and this is my life.
Wow. That's good. There's a lot in that last little bit there to chew on, I think, for our listeners. A couple of the key themes I was hearing was, the idea that from the beginning to the end, the Sabbath is important. The implications, almost like God did that by design, that whole idea. He wanted us to have that. But also this idea of identity, Margaret, that was great to hear you remind us of that. You mentioned it earlier, but then to hear that again, how important it is for us to know who we are and whose we are. And I think that's great. We're gonna stop here. Thank you so much for your time, Margaret, and for just some of the nuggets of wisdom that you shared with us throughout. I think this will be one of those episodes to go back and listen to a couple times, because you'll pick up on something, I think, throughout different points.
Thanks.
Thank you all for tuning in to today's episode. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and found it insightful. Your ministry is important to us, and we hope that you consider your time with us as an investment in your work. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review and share this podcast with your friends. But until next time, keep going wherever Jesus leads.